Good afternoon. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I have the extreme pleasure of introducing our guest authors for today's Book Passage virtual event. I have to admit that I knew next to nothing about the subject of our featured book, the a biography of the pixel, until I picked up the book. I have to say, I think I have the best job because I have the privilege of learning about all manner of subjects from fabulous books and then meeting the expert authors who have written them. Alvy Ray Smith is the author of Biography of the Pixel. He co-founded Pixar and Altamira Software. He was the first director of computer graphics at Lucasfilm and the first graphics fellow at Microsoft. He also has received 2 Technical Academy Awards for his contribution to digital movie making technology. He explains to us how the pixel is the organizing principle of all pictures, from cave paintings to Toy Story. The great digital convergence of all media types into one universal digital medium occurred with little fanfare at the recent turn of the millennium. The bit became the universal medium, and the pixel, a particular packaging of bits, conquered the world. Henceforward, nearly every picture in the world would be composed of pixels: cell phone pictures, app interfaces, Mars rover transmissions, book illustrations, video games. Amazing. Smith's story of the pixel's development begins with Fourier waves, proceeds through Turing machines, and ends with the first digital movies from Pixar, DreamWorks, and Blue Sky. Today, almost all the pictures we encounter are digital, mediated by the pixel, and irretrievably separated from their media. Museums and kindergartens are 2 of the last outposts of the analog. Alvy explains engagingly and accessibly, luckily for Luddites such as myself, how pictures composed of invisible stuff become visible. To discuss Alvy's book and help make sense of this complex yet very interesting subject is Barbara Robertson. Barbara was a senior editor at Computer Graphics World for 25 years and continues working with them and others as a freelance writer. Prior to that, she was an editor and research director for Whole Earth Software Catalog and held editorial positions at 2 personal computer magazines. As a freelance writer, her articles have appeared in many publications and websites. She's written 2 books, and her travel essays have appeared in several anthologies. She's led panels, moderated conferences, and served on film festival juries, and has won many awards for her writings. As you can tell, she's very qualified for this. She had a fellowship to the Book Passage Mystery Writers Conference, which is near and dear to our hearts, and a Humane Issues Award from Dog Writers Association for an article in the Bark magazine. I want to just let our viewers know before I turn it over that you can submit questions if you have any, and we definitely encourage you to do so using the chat feature on the computer. And now a warm welcome to both of you, Alvy and Barbara.
Well, let me start off. Thanks, Allison. Let me start off by just saying how happy I am to be back at Book Passage. In fact, part of the book took place. Part of the creation of this book happened in the cafe at Book Passage, believe it or not. Barbara Robertson, who's going to be my interviewer today, it was also the editor who's my first editor on this book. She's been through every page of this book with me, knows me and the book inside and out. So we would meet. She's from Mill Valley. I'm from Berkeley. We'd meet at the cafe at Book Passage to slog through the details. I just wanted you to see how important she is to this book, and I hand it over to her now.
Thank you, Alvy. So 10 years later, a
Yes.
biography of the pixel. Some people in the audience might think that pixels are those little squares that you see when you zoom in on a computer screen. And some people might not have any idea at all what a pixel is. And some might wonder why you've written a book about them. And we'll get to all that. But first, your book is filled with pictures and drawings. And why is the very first picture a full page, full color picture of a painting of Napoleon?
Napoleon, my favorite tyrant. We'll probably get to this. One of the themes of my book is the role of the tyrant in the creation of high technologies. And in fact, Napoleon is the first tyrant I introduced in the book because he was influential in the life of Fourier, which I assume we will get to sooner or later. But that painting was made in about 1800. It's oil on canvas. And at the time, the painting, you couldn't conceive of separating that painting from its medium, from the oil and the canvas. They were all one thing. The only way to get that painting somewhere else in the world was actually physically grab the painting and carry it with you. There were no photographs even yet. So I guess you could say with photography, the idea of media began, the idea that you can actually separate the picture content from the media and then take it somewhere else and even put it into a different medium. And one of those different media we're going to talk about, of course, is the digital one.
So I remember you telling me years ago that everything we see is waves. And I had absolutely no idea what you were talking about. I do now. So tell us about Fourier and why you started the book with him, who he is, what he did.
Okay, well, so the book begins at the French Revolution, essentially, that the late 1700s, 1789 or so, with this man Joseph Fourier. Now, the name Fourier is very familiar to all of us in the sciences and technologies. We probably use Fourier every day in what we do. But if I ask people in the arts and humanities about Fourier, they don't know who he is. And that's unfortunate because he had one of those beautiful ideas in the world. And that idea is that everything is waves, everything is music. If I think nearly everybody understands that music is a simultaneous sum of sound waves of different frequencies and different amplitudes. I think that's true, that everybody understands that. But Fourier went even further. He says not just music is a sum of waves of different frequencies and different amplitudes, loudnesses. All sound is. Everything that we hear is a sum of these waves, and they're very beautiful, simple waves. We call them sine waves in math. And then, but he didn't stop there. He said all pictures are sums of waves too. And that's the basis of the pixel, derives from that very important idea that Fourier had a long time ago. And by the way, even though people know about in the sciences and technologies think they know Fourier, my discovery over the 10 years is they don't know a thing about Fourier himself, that he almost got his head cut off in the French Revolution, that he was saved from the guillotine by Robespierre losing his head instead. And then our man went off to Egypt with his new buddy, Napoleon Bonaparte. That's why he shows up. And was with the group that discovered the Rosetta Stone, and on and on and on. And it's, chapter 1 of my book is all about this amazing dance between the tyrant and the scientist being the man who brought us the Fourier notion that everything is music.
So how do we go from waves to pixels?
Aha. Well, we get from waves to pixels via what are called samples. Samples is not a very interesting word, but we have an interesting word when the thing being sampled is a picture. We call the sample a pixel. That's what a pixel is, and I'll keep hammering on this. So this guy, there's a big battle about who first proved the sampling theorem, but my belief is, and I established it, I believe, convincingly in chapter 2 of this book, that a Russian communist named Vladimir Kotelnikov was the father of the pixel. Believe it or not, that in 1933, he published a paper in Russian where he proved the sampling theorem. That's the fancy term for what I'm about to talk about, for the first time, including all the nuance that we use in the modern world. So the idea is that given an arbitrary continuous signal, like a sound or a picture, analog, it's defined at every point. So there are an infinity of values in a picture and also in a sound. He's told us you don't have to remember the whole. Well, in fact, you can't remember an infinite number of values. You just can't. That's what infinite means. But you can, if you're careful, take very regular samples of a sound wave or or of a picture, and just remember the samples, and that's all you have to remember. If you think about that, what he basically said was you can throw away the infinity of information between two of the samples. Just throw it away. And I'll give it to you later with this trick that I'm devising called the sampling theorem. So the samples of a picture are the pixels. They exist only at a point. And all of us know enough about simple geometry to know that a point is zero dimensional. You can't see a point. You cannot see a pixel. That's the first surprise I think people will have is you can't see a pixel. And if you've been listening to me, I've never mentioned a little square once. They never were little squares, ever. And maybe we can come back later to why that misperception is so fixed in people's brains. How do you see? So the rest of this theorem, this sampling theorem that the whole modern media world is based on, is how do you get from the samples? So here's my cell phone. I have several billion pixels in there. You probably do in yours too. How do I see the picture that those samples represent, those pixels represent? Well, you spread the pixels with a special shape that I call the spreader. And Kotelnikov shows you exactly what it should be, but the ideal one is impossible to realize in the real world. So we approximate it with all sorts of things. But sort of intuitively, it's the little soft glowy spots on the display of your cell phone. Those little soft glowy spots aren't pixels. A lot of people call them pixels. They're not. They're soft, they're analog, they overlap. They are the spreaders that spread the pixels into the original picture that the pixels represent. Again, I didn't say little square once.
So, Alvy, do you read Russian?
I do not read Russian, but I read math. When I read this 1933 paper by Vladimir Kotelnikov, this is the man's name, I could read it, and it's exactly the way I use the sampling theorem today, including low pass and band pass if you speak the language. Those are subtleties.
Okay, so we have waves and we have pixels. In the first part of your book, you talk about three great ideas. Waves and pixels are two of them. What's the third one?
The third one is computers. You notice I said that somehow the pixels that are in the memory of your cell phone get sent to the display and turned into those little soft glowy spots. Well, that requires computation. It happens so fast that it seems instantaneous to us, but of course it's not. It's a heavy duty computation. So computation is important to us. Who invented computation?
Who invented it?
Who invented that? Well, we have a good strong answer for that. It's Alan Turing. I think it's pretty well known now that he did. Although a lot of people think that Leibniz did it, or Babbage did it, or Ada Lovelace did it. They had ideas that are related to the idea of computation, but they didn't nail it. The person who nailed the concept of the computer was Alan Turing. And when I say the word computer, I mean exactly the following thing: an electronic stored program computer. In other words, it has to be programmable to be a computer. Alan Turing defined it that way. And the original geniuses who brought us the computer all understood that that was the genius idea in the concept.
So we have pixels and we have computers. Mm-hmm. When did we first see them on a computer?
Well, 1947.
1947.
1947. So Kotelnikov proved the sampling theorem in 1933. Turing invented computers and computation in 1936. It took a while for those two things to come together on a computer, and that computer was known as, believe it or not, Baby. The first computer was called Baby, much to my delight. Baby was built in 1948 is the term usually given, the date usually given in Manchester, England. And the engineer, and it used dots on a screen and a rectangular array as its display. as its memory. I mean, not as its display. It didn't have a notion of a display. It just was just coincidence that you could see its memory. And somebody, the engineer, Tom Kilburn, who built Baby, took a picture of what I claim is the very first digital picture in the world, first light. It's in the book. And the whole everything we're talking about today started then.
So you call that digital light, right?
Digital light is a term. Well, Allison in her introduction had a little bit of this. I stumbled on this term in Melbourne 10 years ago. In fact, it was the start of my book at a conference run by a man named Sean Cubitt that used the term digital light. And when I saw that term, I went, oh, that's the word I've been looking for. It's larger than computer graphics, which is what I've devoted my life to. It includes image processing. It includes my Tesla dashboard today, right? It includes all pictures in the world, regardless of where they originated or what they are for. And I needed a larger word to tell people in my book about this field that the pixel addresses and unifies. And digital light, I think, is pretty cool word for it.
So in this first section of your book, you also set up a theme that carries throughout the book, that progress in technology happens when there's an excellent idea, disruptive chaos, and a protective tyrant. Do you have some examples?
When Fourier is the first one, he had this great idea that the world is music. It was the French Revolution was the time of chaos that spurred him into his period of creativity. And Napoleon was his tyrant. At first, Napoleon was his supporter, but Fourier saw too much of Napoleon's military failure in Egypt. And the last thing Napoleon wanted was this blabbermouth Fourier in Paris telling people what he had actually seen. So what he did was Napoleon exiled Fourier to Grenoble, which was in those days was hundreds of miles away from the capital city. And it was exile. Fourier knew he was in exile, but it was a really posh exile. He was the governor of the province, and he had time and space to think out the details of his theory that's changed the world. So I think those things working together happened several times. I have several examples in the book. Shall I do another one?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Well, okay. How about Kotelnikov? Kotelnikov lived through the entire Soviet nightmare. He was born before the revolution, and he lived through all the wars, the Russian Revolution, World Wars I and II, the Cold War. And what he had to contend with was the state security system. So the tyrant in his case was the Soviet security system. The KGB tried to throw him into the Gulag twice. And the only reason he wasn't thrown in the Gulag was he had a protectress named Valeria Golubtsova, who was married to Malenkov, who took over from Stalin as the premier of Soviet Russia. She had enough stuff to protect our man from the Gulag. Wow. The stories just go on and on. Again, he was protected. The tyrant hardly ever knows that he's doing a good thing, but inadvertently does a good thing in the furtherance of the technology.
Wow, cool. So you picked the year 2000 as a pivotal point. Why?
Well, that's the year, más o menos, when the great digital convergence, as I call it, happened. When all the old analog media types converged into one medium, the pixel, in the case of pictures anyhow. Now, in the 90s, people talked about the convergence. I remember at Microsoft, we talked about the convergence, but then it just sort of happened and nobody seemed to have paid any attention. And if you look at the dates, it all happened right around 2000, plus or minus 3 or 4 or 5 years. So I call it, in capital letters, the great digital convergence. It was one of the most amazing things that happened in our lifetimes, and yet nobody paid any attention. I'm trying to pay attention and celebrate it with this book.
Fantastic. So many things happened along the way to make that possible. What was there an overriding hero, dynamo, something that made all of this progress
Oh, I
happen?
think you're getting at Moore's law. Moore's law.
Yeah.
Now, people have heard of Moore's law. You probably think you know what it is. I want to state it again, and I want to try to get across how awesome Moore's law is. It's the supernova that has driven modern technology my entire lifetime, and I suspect it will drive the technology advancements for the lifetime of everybody in this audience. In 1965, so the original computers, there was no Moore's law. As they got more powerful, they got bigger and bigger and bigger until they were the size of buildings, and they were kind of stupid, to be honest. But in 1965, Gordon Moore stated his law. Not sure it's really a law, but he stated it like this: the density of chip components on an integrated circuit chip will double every 1.5 years. I don't know about you, but that doesn't mean very much to me. So I translated it into an equivalent statement. And here it is. Everything good about computers gets better by an order of magnitude every 5 years. And I use the term order of magnitude instead of factor of 10, because an order of magnitude is all we human beings. We puny human beings, we can't think more than an order of magnitude increase. We just lose it after an order of magnitude. You change things by a factor of 10 and we lose it. You have to come up with new conceptualizations to deal with it. What Moore's law says, we're going to have one of those order of magnitude revolutions every 5 years. So in 1965, when he stated it, Moore's law was 1. I made my first computer graphic then, by the way. Today, Moore's law factor sits at 100 billion. Everything about computers that's good, how small they are, how cheap they are, how fast they are, is 100 billion times better today than it was in 1965. And it's going to hit 1 trillion in just a few years, 2025. I could say those numbers, but you don't know what they mean. None of us know what that means. We can only do one of the orders of magnitude. So what we have to do is just get there. And then we figure out, oh, that's what that means. Now I can build on what I understand and go to the next order of magnitude. That's driven everything I've talked about today.
So why did you choose the progress toward making a digital movie and an animated film as a focus for the Pixel's evolution toward becoming what you call the organizing principle of modern media? Why did you choose that?
Yeah, well, I had to, right? That's what I understand. I mean,
right.
Digital light is vast. It includes not only all pictures, nearly all pictures in existence, but nearly all pictures that have ever existed. It's huge. So I could have chosen any subfield and used the history of that subfield as the armature of this book. Well, I know the history and the making of digital movies. That's my life. So I use that as the armature for which to hang the rest of it. But if you think about it, if you understand how a movie's made, then you kind of understand how virtual reality works, and you kind of understand how games work. I mean, they're closely related, and they all at some point reduce to the pixel. So that's the atom, that's the elementary particle of this field. And it's kind of nice, I think, that it's all held together by some 3 beautiful ideas and one simple atom.
It's incredible. So when did you become part of this story, you personally?
Well, I guess I just said I made my first picture in 1964, actually, just before Moore's law.
Right.
In New Mexico, I was hired as a junior engineer designing antennas for the Nimbus weather satellite, one of the first weather satellites. And the old engineers thought they had me. My first job, they said, Alvy, we want you to draw an equally angular spiral, and I forgot how many turns. And I know they thought it would take me a month using drafting tools to draw that spiral. But I said, oh, a computer can do that. And the next day I showed up with an equiangular spiral generated by all the old engineers. Oh, computers can. Yes. I said, yes, they can. And that was my first. But
then you went on to join Xerox PARC. And,
yeah, Xerox PARC, I guess, is kind of. Xerox PARC was Dick Shout, my buddy, my late great buddy Dick Shelp built a program called Super Paint at Xerox PARC, one of the first exploitations of color pixels. And when I saw that, by the way, I painted pictures when I was a kid, oils and acrylics on canvas. And I was also a computer guy. So when I saw Super Paint, which is what he called his program, Dick called his program, I went, that's me. Painting, computers, color, this is me. And, basically Pixar came out of that with the help of a lot of other people, of course.
So then you went to NYIT, where you joined a group that eventually became the group that went to Lucasfilm and formed Pixar. But while you're at NYIT, a few big things happened in terms of the evolution.
Well,
are you willing to
first of
talk
all,
about yourself a little bit?
Yeah, okay. So I got fired from Xerox PARC, to tell you the truth, because they decided not to do color. And they said, we've made a corporate decision to go black and white. I went, oh, okay. I went in search of the next color memory. So my friend Dick had built the first color memory, basically. And it wasn't the first, by the way. The first one's in the book. I didn't find out the first one until I wrote this book, did the research for this book. But it was one of the earliest computer color memories. So my buddy David DeFrancisco and I were in search of a National Endowment for the Arts grant so that we could make art in this new medium of pixels, color pixels. Suddenly I've lost access to the only such beast in the world, and I had to find the next one. And I found it at the New York Institute of Technology. This crazy man, Alex Schur, had bought for $80,000. Now, you listen to these numbers. For $80,000, he bought us a 500 by 500 pixel memory, 8 bits deep, 256 colors. And one night he said, Alvy, what do we need in order to stay ahead of the field? And I said, well, if you buy me 2 more of these 8-bit thingies, I can cobble them together into a 24-bit thingy, and then we'll have 16 million colors, and we can do anything. Not knowing whether Alex Schur really got what I'd said, right? A few weeks later, he says, Alvy, I bought you 5 more of those 8-bit thingies, so you'd have 2 of those 24-bit thingies. In today's dollars, he just said, I just spent $2 million on your say-so that we'd be out in the lead of the field. I only, in retrospect, writing the books, understand how awesome that move was. I didn't get it at the time. I was thrilled, of course, but I didn't understand financially what he had done. It was amazing. And that group was the group that went to Lucasfilm and then formed Pixar. So
one of the earliest appearances of colored pixels in a feature film was a visual effect that your computer graphics team at Lucasfilm created for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. You want to talk a little bit about the Genesis effect?
Sure. Well, first of all, why Star Trek II, we did this at Lucasfilm, but Star Trek II is not a George Lucas movie. So what's that? How did that happen? Well, I thought George Lucas had hired us to make pictures in his movies. And I started hiring this group of geniuses of the first order to come join us at Lucasfilm to be in the movies. And they came. Amazing people. The book has every one of them named and what they did. I won't do it now, but I call them my geniuses. George Lucas never came and knocked on my door. And all of a sudden I went, oh my gosh, he doesn't get it. We were building hardware and software for him. He had a vision of digitizing the movie making process, which was a great vision. And we were happy to pay our dues by helping him invent his vision. But we thought we would be in the movie. It didn't happen. He didn't knock on the door. Who knocked on the door was Paramount with Star Trek II. They asked Industrial Light and Magic, the special effects division of Lucasfilm, for some special effects for their movie. And they wanted some of this color graphic stuff. So that's how we got the break to be in a major motion picture. The group that basically went on became Pixar. We got our first outing on the screen with this 1-minute piece called the Genesis demo in Star Trek II. And by the way, to us, yes, we were we were in a major motion picture, and that was exciting, and people liked it, and that was good. But what it really was to us was a 60-second commercial to George Lucas to tell him what he had so that he would know what he, and in fact, he stepped 1 foot into my office the day after the premiere and said, "Great camera move," which is what we were trying to impress him with. He got it, and he asked us to be in his next movie, and he told his buddy Steven Spielberg about us, and off the story went.
Fantastic. And then you guys went on and founded Pixar, and kind of the rest is history that we kind of all know pretty well.
Pretty well,
So
yeah.
pretty well. So Alvy, this is a book about technology, and you've created, I think, just remarkably understandable explanations of how things work. They're just
Thank you.
incredible. It just blew my mind all the way through. But it's also about the people that invented the technology. So what surprises did you uncover?
Well, let's see. Are you getting at something in particular that I'm missing?
No, no. I know that there were many, so just pick one.
Let's see. Well, stepping back to New York Tech, what we were doing there was helping out an old-fashioned cell animation team that the owner of New York Tech had put together. They were making a movie called Tubby the Tuba, the old-fashioned way, painting ink on celluloids and then filling in with color. And Alexander Shure had figured out that a computer could help somehow, but he didn't really understand how that was. But he bought the equipment. Ed Catmull, who's the co-founder of Pixar with me, we met each other at New York Institute of Technology, wrote an in-betweening program in 2 dimensions because that's all computers could do at the time. They were really slow. Moore's law was way back there. And we discovered, much to our dismay, is that it was too hard. Even though Ed wrote a beautiful program called Tween, it was too, and he answered every suggestion that the animators brought him. It just turned out to be too hard for the animators to learn how to do. Long story short, 3D animation turns out to be easier than 2D animation. We didn't get that at first. We had to wait for 3D to become Moore's law capable, computers to be capable of doing 3D before we could actually understand it was easier. That was a surprise. Another surprise was motion blur. If you don't, so animated movies are a sequence of stills. This turns out not to be actually true, as I make clear in my book, but if you don't blur an object in the direction of motion, it'll jitter across the screen, and it's very unpleasant, and nobody will want to watch that. And computer animation would fail if we didn't solve the motion blur problem. So Ed Catmull started a competition amongst these geniuses, these collected geniuses at Lucasfilm, to solve that problem. And I think Ed thought he was going to solve it because he had been thinking about it more than anybody else. So it's kind of a measure of his leadership capability that he started this, but the result was not what he expected. Some of the geniuses, Lauren Carpenter, Rob Cook, and Tom Porter, came in with this solution that solved it in an astonishing way. And it solved a bunch of other problems at the same time. I can't go into it here, but it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful solution. And it put us over the edge technologically in the field, in the race to the first digital movie, which of course was our goal, was to be the first people on the planet to make a digital movie. A 20-year goal, by the way. We first got that goal in mind in the 70s, mid-70s on Long Island. And it took Toy Story to finally implement it 20 years later.
And was that Moore's law?
Absolutely.
Because of Moore's law that it took that long?
It took Moore's law. In fact, a Japanese company came to me at Lucasfilm and said, "We want to make the first movie with you guys." Oh, here it is. Somebody's ready to step up. And they wanted to make it based on this character, this Monkey King character that I was a fan of, very popular character in Asia. So we started working. I'd our animator John Lester started doing character studies, and there were, story treatments were written and marketing studies were done, and we were working away on this movie when all of a sudden I said, okay, it's time for me to come up with the number that I need to charge this company to pay for the production of this movie. Just sort of thinking intuitively that Moore's Law had arrived, but it hadn't. I sat down and nobody had costed such a movie before. I did, and much to my dismay, I found out that, oh my gosh, we need another 5 years of Moore's Law. We need another order of magnitude. It was going to cost too much for this Japanese company, and worse, it was going to take too long to compute. So I had to back out of the deal. But that's at that point, Ed and I, which was roughly, it was just before we formed Pixar, we knew at that point that we could not be a movie company because we needed another order of magnitude for Moore's Law.
Wow. So I want to say now that I have a few more questions for Alvy, but in about, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from everyone else. So if you have any, please type them into chat and we'll get to them. But I wanted to ask you, what was the hardest chapter to write?
Oh, hardest chapter.
Yeah.
They were all hard, Barbara. That's why it took 10 years.
I know.
Well, this is not the right answer. This is not this is not an answer to the question you asked, but it's the chapter that I was most astonished by.
Okay.
And I hope that survived. That's okay. That was chapter 2, the one about Vladimir Kotelnikov. This amazing man. So we were all taught as American, I was an engineering student. When I went through college, there was no computer science yet. I took engineering, and I learned the sampling theorem. And I was taught that Claude Shannon, a famous American engineer and scientist, had proved the theorem for the first time. So when I sat down to write chapter 2, it was going to be about this guy, Claude Shannon. Well, I looked into it, and Claude Shannon didn't do it. He never even claimed he did it. So then that's why it took me so long to write this chapter. I had to figure out who wrote the sampling, who first proved the sampling theorem. Well, it turns out every country has a claimant. So I had to go in and master the math of every one of these claimants and figure out who actually, and there are a lot of nuances to the statement of the theorem. So I wanted the guy who did it the way I use it first. And I'm convinced it's this guy, Vladimir Kotelnikov, who managed to stay out of the gulag because he had a protectress, married to the bloody Malenkov character. So I found out all sorts of interesting things. I had to master Soviet history, which I didn't know a thing about. And I'm sort of embarrassed that I was so ignorant of it now. I discovered such things as he came to America, Kotelnikov did. He came to America in 1957 to a conference in Boulder, Colorado. And I think I'm the first person to discover this. He announced to us that Russia was going to put up a satellite, and it was going to broadcast at 2 particular frequencies. He told us, and it happened 2 months later. He told us about Sputnik, and it was indeed those 2 frequencies that Sputnik broadcast at. He was a big honcho in the space effort, the Soviet space effort. And oh, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. I want to answer your questions.
I was just going to say you had a great picture of him in the book.
Yeah, okay. The last picture I have of Kotelnikov was a shocker, and I got it from Vladimir Putin's website. It's a picture of Kotelnikov. He's an old man now. It's on the 70th anniversary of the proof of the famous theorem that I've been talking about to you today, the sampling theorem. 70th anniversary. Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is standing with with Kotelnikov, 2 Vladimirs, in the Kremlin. Kotelnikov is wearing every merit badge of the Soviet Union, the orders of Stalin, the orders of Lenin, the red this, the red that. And Putin is knighting him, knighting is not the right term, but whatever the term is in Russia, this very rare award for being basically for proving the sampling theorem, right? It's an amazing picture. And his
So,
last job, let me tell you about the last job.
oh yeah, go ahead.
Kutelikov's last job, listen to this, because this is the father of the pixel. His last job was for 8 years, he was chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Russia.
Wow.
It's just a sinecure job, but still.
So I know it took you 10 years to research and write this book. We probably have some aspiring authors in the audience. What advice would you give to your 10 years younger self as he was about to start on this journey?
Oh, well, marry the right woman.
Aha.
My wife, Alison Gopnik, was an accomplished author, and she taught me some of the, I don't know whether I could have done it without her early advice about how to write. I was a technical writer. I've written a lot of technical papers. And she said, Alvy, you have to unpack these sentences. Nobody in the real world could understand. You have about 5 paragraphs in each sentence. You know, I didn't know that's just how it always written, because you usually have a page count in learned journals that you can't exceed. So that helped a lot. And then another, you need to have a great friend like Barbara Robertson.
Oh, come on.
Help you edit. I know that's not helping the people you just asked me to address, but that was 2 of my major aids. 10,000 hours. Let me just mention 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
Anytime the conventional wisdom is after you've done something for 10,000 hours, you become proficient at it. And I've now put in my 10,000 hours. I think you just have to do it to get to that point where the words seem to have flowed right directly out of your subconscious onto the page. It never happens until about the 50th or maybe the 100th edit. That's my advice.
That's cool. So keep at it is basically the advice.
Keep at it. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the one thing you hope people will take away from the book?
That one thing is that be wary of histories that are simple narratives. Especially in the technologies, it just doesn't happen that way, where there's a single hero from which all things flow, some creative genius. The closest approximation of that in the story of the pixel was Alan Turing and the computer, but even that story is not a straight line narrative. And it's so my trick is to avoid the narrative. In fact, raise a red flag if I ever see a simple narrative, and use the idea of genealogies or family trees of all the people and how they interact and stab each other in the back and so forth to get the ideas developed to the point. That's why I actually tell the story of DreamWorks and Blue Sky along with the story of Pixar. It's like they all come out of the same interweavings of influences that Pixar did. And they showed up almost at the same time at the millennium with the first digital movies.
Cool. We have a question from someone that mirrors one of the questions I was going to ask you. Her question is from Julie Herbert. Says, can you talk about the future of computer graphics in movies? I was going to ask, where do you think the pixel will take us next? Which is
well, those are all right. Let me.
Okay, maybe they're 2 different questions.
Well, I think so. If you think about Moore's law, what's the lesson for Moore's law? Is you don't know what's going to happen order of magnitude from now. I can invent things that have to do with bigger numbers, but the real import of Moore's law is you don't understand what those big numbers actually mean until you get there. So and another thing I like to say is if you can understand what's going to happen 10 years from now, 5 years from now, order of magnitude from now, you can probably become a billionaire. It's a very hard thing to do. All right, with that in mind, my answer is I really don't know where movies are going to go, but it's going to be kind of surprising and amazing, I'm sure. Let me tell you how I've been surprised just recently. This last year or so, a chip came out called the Unreal Engine that does in real time. So I'm not sure what they mean by that term, but let's say it means 30 times a second. they generate a new picture with the complexity of 20 to 80 million polygons per frame in real time, shaded, colored, lit from light sources, shadowed, everything. Well, to put that in context, back in Lucasfilm in the 80s, I think it was Lauren Carpenter that came up with the number that we used as our guiding principle of the time. 80 million polygons per frame was sort of what we had to aim for. None of our software could break at that number. But we were willing to spend 30 hours to compute a picture of that complexity. What happened last year? And I could tell you from the Moore's law that this would happen sooner or later, but I still was awestruck when I saw this happening in real time. A total delight, I might add. But Moore's law is still going. So what happens in order of magnitude beyond that? The mind boggles, mine does. So one thing that's come out of all this is virtual reality has become a reality, so to speak. And I'm, in fact, advising a little startup company called Biography Studios in the Valley that does virtual reality. And I'm tracking that virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, all of those variations very closely, because I think that's one of the more interesting fields of research right now.
Cool. So we have a question from Karen Birch, who wants to know what your thoughts about Bob Abel, RA&A, and Synapse technologies and the contributions to the field, such as painting with light.
Well, I'm not sure I recognize all those, but Bob Abel for sure was a biggie along the way. There were lots of so like I said, it's not a single narrative through the field of even advanced computer graphics. And Bob Abel was one of the early pioneers of sophisticated special effects, and there's a whole story there, that I only just mentioned, I think, somewhere in my book. That should be developed into its own book, probably. Okay, in my book, the way I treat painting with light, the future of it or the current state of it is with a painting by my friend Darcy Gerbhardt. Darcy, I have a painting of hers reproduced in the book. She uses, she's been using paint programs. So I wrote one of the early paint. I wrote the first RGB paint program. She's been using paint programs for decades. She's now started using tilt brush, which is a virtual reality or augmented reality. You paint strokes in 3 dimensions, and they're textured and they cast shadows on one another. They're 3D, in other words, 3-dimensional paint strokes. And then she combines the 2D world that she can see with her camera with these virtual 3D paint strokes in innovative ways. And I think her paintings have just leapt alive in a way I've never seen before. That's my way of celebrating painting with light.
Cool. So is there any technology other than virtual reality that you're excited about, looking forward to?
Well, virtual reality almost sounds old-fashioned. If you when I look out there now, what I'm most excited about is what I call mixed reality, and I'm not sure about these terms anymore, or extended reality. All these words are sort of weird takes on the word reality. The notion is that computer graphics is built on the idea that you have a 3-dimensional model inside your computer and you render that to a screen in 2 dimensions. The idea of mixed reality is you grab a scene from the world, you digitize the room you're in, Barbara. You grab that scene and you deduce somehow what the 3D geometry of that is that would describe that room in order to render that room. And then you take that model and you mix it with the model you actually made in geometry in such a way that that, you know, the light reflects off of one world into the other world. You can see through objects in one of the worlds into objects in the other world. I think there's like a generation of computer, you know, SIGGRAPH papers there. I'm not sure, but that's
So,
really exciting.
so we have pixels that you're making combined with pixels that you're taking into a
That's
whole
right. Mixing and
image.
taking, making and taking, which is one of my main subdivisions, as Barbara knows, in my book. Um, Putting them together in innovative ways that probably we don't even know how to talk about yet.
Right. What about AI?
Yeah, what about
Oh.
AI? Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say I started out in AI in 1965. I went to Stanford University for graduate school in this new sexy subject called AI. It's that old, folks. It's been a great marketing term for over 50 years. And after about 2 years, I learned Lisp from McCarthy and so forth. I said, I like the idea that machines could be intelligent. I still do, but I didn't understand then how it was possible, and I still don't. But I've been tracking it all along. In fact, I thought it wasn't going to happen in my lifetime, and I changed fields so that I could do something like make the first digital movie that I could do in my lifetime. But now I'm back to tracking AI, and it's getting pretty darn interesting. And here's the problem. Well, let me tell you an anecdote. One of my friends, John Bronskill, he used to write filters for Photoshop. He's a pixel packer like I am. He came to me when my wife Allison and I were on sabbatical in Cambridge, England, and said, "Hey, Alvy, we don't need to program anymore." And I said, what do you mean? He says, "Well, look, read this paper." And he handed me a paper from Berkeley, where I live and where my wife is a professor, and said, and he said, "Look at this." And the paper was about using a network, a trained network, training this network with 1,000 pictures of horses, arbitrary numbers of horses in any arrangement, no textual, no text, just pictures, and 1,000 pictures of zebras. And the result of after the training of this network was you would hand the network a picture of horses, and it would give you back exactly the same picture, but every horse had been turned into a zebra, or vice versa. And I looked at that for a moment. I said, I don't even think, how does that work? I don't even think that's a well-posed problem. And John said, I don't know. Nobody does. It just works. And it's too hard to reverse engineer to figure out what's going on. And that's when it hit me. He said, oh my gosh, I always thought when AI got explained, I would be able to understand the explanation. And now I'm at the point where, no, maybe we can't understand the explanation of AI, which brings me back to one of the early exciting. Alan Turing, when he invented computation, was always most fascinated by what happens when a computer computes on itself. Well, during most of my career, we disallowed that. You would not allow a program to modify the program memory. Because all kinds of havoc tore loose and computers crashed all the time if you let that happen. But I think these nets actually are computers that compute on themselves. And when you get to these places that maybe we won't even understand. And here's where I start waving my hands mightily, obviously, and we just need to ride the wave and see where it goes.
Speaking of waves.
Yes.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I see a question just popped up. What name do you give to the little squares on the screen?
What you name them?
What little squares on what screen?
You do have the name.
I'm not sure, Stephen, what little squares you're talking about. There are no little squares on a screen if it's a proper representation.
Right.
And they're never. And by the way, if I give the history of digital light in the book, and I show you the first pictures, and we step through decade by decade. There are never any little squares. So where did this notion of the little squares and pixelation come from? I said that and didn't come back to it. Well, one place it comes from is every app has this function called zoom, or some relative of zoom in, zoom out. What zoom does, and sure enough, if you use zoom, it looks like the screen is filled with little squares. So, but what zoom is a cheap and dirty trick from the bad old days of slow computers that should be done away with in this modern age. It never was right, and it's a lie. All zoom does is take a pixel and say we want to magnify by 20. Well, it takes a picture and replaces every pixel with a 20 by 20 square array of pixels of one color, which looks like what? What a surprise. It looks like a square, but it's not a picture of up close of the original pixels. It's just not, that's not how, that's a lie. But so many people have seen zoom pictures, they just assume that they're accurate. They're not. So why is it so satisfying to see an array of squares? And I think, for one thing, nobody ever said no when people use this as a representation of pixels. I'm saying no loudly. Okay. As I went through the history of digital light, I noticed that all along, at every age, people thought, at every decade, people had a notion of what computer pictures had to look like. At first, they had to be rigid and linear and had to have stair steps on the lines and blocky. Why? Because that was the model that people had of computers. Computers were linear, rigid, mechanical, blocky. Therefore, their pictures had to be. But in every case, it just boiled down to people didn't understand what computers are. I spent a long time in this book trying to tell people how wonderful the notion of computation is, and that it is the most malleable tool that humankind has ever invented. There's nothing about computers that says you have to be rigid, linear, blocky, little squares. I think the little squares come out of people just assumed that was what computer pictures had to look like at some level, but it's not so.
So do we have a rigid view of what computer pictures should look like right now? Maybe with a particular kind of perspective. And
yeah, well, one of the themes I bring forward in the book, I think original themes, I call the central dogma, is that and this got adopted in the computer graphics world without ever even being identified. We will model the world inside a computer using Euclidean geometry. We will render it to the screen. First of all, we'll color the objects and make them move using Newtonian physics. And we will render it into 2 dimensions using Renaissance perspective. Now, I call this the central dogma because there's nothing about computers that requires us to use Euclidean geometry, Newtonian physics, or Renaissance perspective. There's nothing about computers that requires those 3 things. We just do because those are the things, those are the 3 of the ways that we describe the real world scientifically and fairly accurately, as long as you don't get out to the speed of light or so forth. So what I want to tell artists out there is, well, first of all, the central dogma has been, I call it a symphonic form. It's a form we just adopted. Every Pixar movie is within the central dogma. Everybody, any digital movie you see today, with one exception, is it's a Pixar exception, but I won't go into that right now, honors the central dogma. If you're an artist out there, you can break out of the central dogma. There's nothing about computers and making art that requires the use of central dogma.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay.
That's a good way to end, actually.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to us today. And Alvy, I really appreciate, as a layperson, the way you explain the science and the engineering and the behind the scenes aspect of computers. It really helps to have someone explain it in a way that we can understand it. And I think that's often unusual for many scientists and engineers to be able to to talk to us in a way we can understand it. So thank you so much. And thank you for this fantastic book. I want to also thank our viewers for spending this last hour with us. And you can purchase the book at Book Passage. We have signed copies. I think this is a fabulous book to have as a reference in your library, as a gift for someone who'd appreciate it. And you can call Book Passage and order it. You can order it over our website, and we are open and you can come in and visit us. So thank you again so much. We really appreciate it. And until next time, everybody, please stay safe and take care.
Bye, everybody.